It was supposed to be just another job. Change a faulty garage light, tighten up a few loose wires, get paid, and move on. The house was modest, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood that hadn't changed much since the 90s. The kind of place where the wind always carried the smell of trimmed grass in the past. I pulled my van into the cracked driveway, toolbox in hand. The garage door was already open, revealing a cluttered space that looked less like a place for cars and more like a time capsule. Old paint cans, half-finished DIY projects, a bicycle missing its chain, and dusty boxes labeled Xmas stuff, all stacked around a rusty workbench. There was something lived-in about the space. Chaotic, sure, but comforting. Like its owner didn't mind the mess because it told her story. She stepped out from a side door just as I started setting up. "You the electrician?" she asked, wiping, her hands on a dish towel that had clearly retired from kitchen duty long ago. "That's me," I said, smiling. "You Linda?" "The one and only. Light went out 3 days ago. I tried YouTube. Nearly electrocuted myself. Figured it was time to call a professional." There was a confidence in her voice, but it came laced with something softer. Tiredness, maybe. She looked to be in her early 50s, though her eyes had the restless energy of someone still figuring things out. Gray strands threaded through dark brown hair, and laugh lines curved naturally around her mouth. She wore jeans, a faded hoodie, and those thick socks people never admit they wear all day. She was vibrant, no doubt about it, but there was a loneliness hanging around her like perfume, subtle but unmistakable. As I examined the light fixture, she stayed nearby, watching. Not in that nosy, hovering way some clients do. More like she didn't want to be alone in the silence. "How long you been doing this?" she asked. "Electric work?" 15 years. Before that, construction. Before that, thought I was going to be a rock star. I chuckled. Didn't pan out. "I played drums in high school," she said proudly. "Got kicked. Out for skipping class to follow a guy in a band. Don't regret it, he was terrible, but the music was good." We both laughed, and I felt the atmosphere shift. It was light, but there was something else underneath it, like the laughter was just floating on top of something deeper. I got up on the ladder and removed the faulty bulb, unscrewing the old fixture. Wires were brittle and outdated. Wouldn't take long to replace, but I wasn't in a hurry. Not today. "Hope you don't mind me talking," she said after a minute. "Garage feels too quiet. House feels too quiet." "I don't mind," I said honestly. She stood there for a second, then blurted out, half laughing, "I'm 50. Will you marry me?" My hands paused mid-wire. She waved a hand and laughed it off quickly. "Just kidding. God, I always do that. Say dumb things when the silence gets awkward. Ignore me." I laughed too, but I was still caught a little off guard. Not because I believed she was serious, but because I wasn't entirely sure she wasn't. There was a flicker in her eyes, that little pause between the joke and the laugh, where something genuine tried to sneak through. "I get it," I said. "Sometimes silence is louder than the noise." That made her look at me, just a beat longer than casual conversation called for. Then she smiled, the kind of smile you give a stranger when you realize you feel oddly safe with them. I finished up the repair, tested the switch. The new light buzzed quietly, then bloomed to life. Bright, steady. "Let there be light," I said, climbing down. She clapped once, theatrically. "A miracle. Thank you, O mighty fixer of garage darkness." I packed up my tools and gave her the invoice. She signed it without looking. "Take care, Linda," I said, pausing at the edge of the garage. "You too, Mr. Rockstar." I drove off thinking about that moment, her joke, her eyes, the unspoken parts she didn't know how to hide. It stayed with me longer than it should have for such a short visit. On the drive home, the radio played, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept drifting back to that cluttered garage and the woman who filled it with more character than any job I'd done in months. It wasn't just the light that switched on that day. Something else did too. It was 3 days later when she called again. "Hey, it's Linda." Her voice came through my voicemail first. "I think the motion lights outside the garage aren't working properly. Maybe another short circuit? If you're around, no rush." The lights were fine the last time I was there. Practically brand new. But something in her voice said this wasn't about the lights. Not really. I showed up the next afternoon, tools in hand, though I already knew I wouldn't need most of them. The sun was still hanging over the rooftops, casting long shadows across her driveway. Linda was already outside, fiddling with a rake she clearly wasn't using. "They acting up again?" I asked, glancing up at the motion lights. "Not really," she admitted with a sheepish smile. "But you said you didn't mind the talking." I nodded, quietly relieved. "Talking's free. But now I'm gonna have to charge you for emotional labor." She laughed at that. "I'm worth it, I swear." I pretended to examine the motion sensor, flipping the light switch a few times, just enough to feel like I was earning my visit. We ended up sitting on her front porch steps, each with a glass of lukewarm iced tea. Her yard had the same character as her garage, slightly chaotic but somehow warm. Overgrown lavender near the mailbox. A faded gnome guarding the garden bed. The kind of place they grew on you without asking for permission. "Do you ever feel invisible after 40? She asked out of nowhere. I turned slightly, looking at her. Her face was calm, but her hands fidgeted with the hem of her hoodie. "All the time?" I said honestly. "It's like people stop seeing you, like you've been filed away under used to matter." Linda nodded, her gaze fixed somewhere distant. "I used to be the mom everyone needed. The friend who planned everything, the one people called when they were falling apart." Her voice cracked just barely. "Now I sit in my house and pretend I enjoy the silence. My kids live in other states, they love me, sure, but from far away. And Rachel, my sister, she checks in like I'm her project." I listened, not just to the words but to the pause between them, the parts she didn't say aloud. "I get it," I said. "Divorced 7 years ago, never really bounced back. I work, I go home, I microwave stuff. Sometimes I watch reruns of shows I didn't even like the first time." That made her laugh again, but it was softer this time. "So what keeps you going?" she asked. I thought for a second. "People like you, I guess." She looked at me then, not with surprise but with quiet appreciation. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't romantic. It was something harder to define. Respect, maybe. A shared loneliness made less heavy by being acknowledged. That night, I stopped by Tom's garage on my way home. He was under the hood of his old Mustang, cursing at a stripped bolt. "You're out late," he muttered without looking up. "Let me guess. Linda called again?" She said her motion lights were acting up. Tom popped his head out, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You fixing lights or hearts, man?" I smirked. "Just being a decent human." Tom wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the hood. "Be careful. Sometimes people don't need you to fix them. They just need you to sit there and not say something dumb." "Thanks, Yoda." He pointed a greasy finger at me. "I'm serious. You've got this thing where you take on everybody's mess like it's your own. Just don't lose yourself in it." I nodded, knowing he was right, but also knowing I'd still show up if Linda called again. A few days later, I met Rachel. She was coming out just as I was going in, Tight ponytail, sharp eyes, a clipboard in hand, like she was always running a meeting in her head. "You're the handyman?" she asked. "Electrician," I corrected, smiling. She didn't return it. "You're here a lot. Linda's lights need extra love." She crossed her arms. "Or maybe she's lonely and attaching to the first person who listens. It's kind of her pattern." That stung. Not because it was rude, but because it might have been true. "I'm not here to lead anyone on," I said evenly. Rachel looked me over like she was assessing drywall for cracks. Then she softened. "Just a little. She's fragile right now. Be kind, but be honest. Don't pretend you can give her something if you can't." I nodded. "Fair enough." When I went inside, Linda was lighting a candle in the kitchen. "Was that Rachel?" I asked. She sighed. "She means well. She's just always waiting for the other shoe to drop." I helped her tighten a loose fixture above the sink and stayed a little longer than necessary. We didn't talk much this time. We just existed in the same space, and somehow that was enough. The calls became a rhythm, not frequent enough to feel needy, just steady, real. Each time I saw her, I noticed things. How she kept the kitchen clean but left coffee mugs out like reminders. How she laughed at her own bad jokes but always watched me afterward, like trying to gauge if she'd said too much. And each time, I found myself looking forward to that voice again. Not because she needed me, but because maybe for a little while I needed her too. It was one of those slow gray afternoons where the sky couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or just hang heavy with clouds. I had just finished rewiring a faulty light switch in Linda's hallway, a quick job, but she hovered nearby, the whole time, holding the screws, offering me tea, asking questions she already knew the answers to. When I was putting my tools back into the bag, she cleared her throat. "You want coffee?" she asked. "I made a fresh pot." Well, fresh enough. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I did. And that somehow made it feel like a line was being crossed. But her expression wasn't hopeful or eager. It was simply honest, like she needed the company more than the coffee. "Sure," I said. "As long as it's not decaf." She grinned. "What do I look like? Someone who's given up?" We walked into her living room, and for the first time I really saw it. The garage and kitchen had always been where we stayed, but the living room was different. Personal. Lived in. A soft brown couch with worn armrests. A crocheted blanket draped over the back. Shelves full of books with dog-eared pages. A few framed photos. Her kids when they were little. A younger version of herself in a floppy sun hat. And one photo of her and another woman who looked strikingly like Rachel, both laughing at something off camera. It wasn't a fancy room, but it had warmth. The kind you can't decorate into existence. The kind that only shows up after years of trying. She poured us each a mug and settled into the opposite end of the couch, tucking her feet under her. I sat gingerly, unsure of the rules now that I wasn't standing behind a job. For a moment, we just sipped and let the silence take up space. "You know," she said eventually, staring into her cup, "my biggest regret isn't the divorce." I glanced over, not sure what to say, so I didn't say anything. "It's not trying again," she continued. "After it all fell apart, I told myself I needed time. To heal. To get strong. I made routines. I got used to sleeping in the middle of the bed. I told everyone I was fine, and after a while I almost believed it." She leaned her head back against the couch cushion and exhaled. But years went by, and I never looked up. One day I was 45, then 50, And now, I spend more time talking to light bulbs than people. I offered a small smile, not to dismiss what she said, but to let her know I was listening. I remember my 25th birthday, she said after a beat. I had this whole plan. I was going to travel the world before 30, start a business, maybe write a book. I remember sitting with my girlfriends that night thinking I have so much time, and then I blinked. And here I am. I nodded, swallowing hard. Her words hit a little too close to my own story. Yeah, I said, swirling the last bit of coffee in my mug. I used to tell people I became an electrician because I like fixing things. Truth is, it just became easier than fixing myself. She looked at me then, not like a woman looking at a man, just one tired soul looking at another. You know what's scarier than getting old alone? She asked quietly. What? I said, already sure I wouldn't like the answer. Getting old pretending you're not lonely. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry. But there was something raw in her voice that made the room feel still, like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us had words for. I didn't respond. Not with a joke, not with a clever line. Just sat there beside her in the quiet, letting it fill the cracks we didn't know we had. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled a wind chime near the porch. The sound was soft, but in that moment it felt almost profound, like the universe reminding us it was still moving, even if we weren't. We sat like that for a long time. No phones, no distractions, just two people, past the halfway point of life, wondering how the years had folded in on themselves so quickly. I watched as she stared out the window, eyes following the rhythm of branches swaying in the breeze. I could see the girl who once believed she had all the time in the world, and I wondered what version of myself she saw when she looked at me. We didn't touch. There was no dramatic moment, no swelling music, just a presence, a knowing. The key, quiet realization that neither of us was entirely alone anymore. Not in that room, not in that hour. Eventually she smiled, a small, real smile. Thanks for staying, she said softly. Thanks for the coffee, I replied, but we both knew it wasn't about the coffee. When I left that day, I didn't feel like I was walking away from a job. I felt like I was leaving, something behind, something safe, fragile, and beginning to matter. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't drive home thinking about how to fill the silence, because part of me was still sitting on that couch. Rachel showed up at my worksite. It was a Thursday and I was elbow deep in a fuse box at a small apartment downtown when I heard her voice behind me. We need to talk. I turned, startled to find her in heels and a blazer, arms crossed like she was walking into a courtroom. Rachel, I said, blinking sweat from my eyes. Everything okay with Linda? That's exactly what I want to know. She didn't mince words. Are you leading her on? Or just too broken to say no? The question landed like a slap. I stood there not angry, just stunned by the force of it. I'm not leading anyone, I said finally. She didn't back down. She's fragile, lonelier than she lets on, and you don't even know what you want. She's not a project, Rachel, and I'm not here to fix her. No, she said, her voice sharp. But are you here for her, or just for the feeling she gives you when you don't feel like a mess? She didn't wait for an answer, just turned and left, her heels clicking like punctuation down the hallway. Later that night, I was in Tom's garage again. He handed me a beer without asking. You look like someone ran you over emotionally, he said. I told him about Rachel, about the words I couldn't shake. He listened, poking at the fire pit with a stick. Then he said, "Don't confuse kindness for love, man. It feels real, sure. But sometimes when you're both lonely, you build a house out of duct tape and think it's a home." I stared at the flames. It doesn't feel fake. Does it feel stable? That was the question. And I didn't know the answer. For the next few days, Linda went silent. No texts, no calls, no casual updates or half-made-up repairs. Just nothing. I stared at my phone more than I should have. Told myself to give her space. Maybe Rachel had gotten to her. Maybe I had. Maybe we had already slipped back into the quiet lives we came from. But on day 6, I drove over. Her porch light was off. The blinds were drawn. I knocked once, then again. No answer. I circled around to the side window and knocked on the glass. Soft voice finally called out, "Doors open." She looked pale, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, hair pulled back messily, a half-empty tea mug on the coffee table. "I didn't want to be seen like this," she said, her voice hoarse. "I caught something, probably the flu. It'll pass." "You could have said something." I didn't want pity. "It's not pity, Linda. It's care." She looked away. I came back 20 minutes later with soup and a bag of groceries. She didn't protest. Just gave me a look that said thank you, even if the words never came. While she rested, I fixed the ceiling fan in her bedroom. It had been humming too loud the last time I was here. I'd remembered. Later, when I handed her a bowl of soup, she looked at me and whispered, "You don't have to fix everything, you know." I paused, set the bowl down gently. "Some things don't need fixing," I said. "They just need someone to sit with them." She blinked fast, looking down at her hands. Then she did something small but deeply brave. She leaned slightly toward me, just enough for our arms to touch. No words, no explanation, just the simple act of letting someone in. In that moment, something shifted. Not because she let her guard down, but because I realized I had too. I wasn't saving her. I wasn't showing up out of guilt or duty. I was showing up because being with her made me feel less like a man who had spent years patching his life with tools and habits. Being with her made the world feel less like a job to survive and more like a place to simply be. And in her quiet, feverish silence, I felt steadier than I had in years. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real. And maybe, for two people who'd almost given up, that was more than enough. It was spring when I really noticed the change, not in Linda, not even in me, but in us. The cold had lifted. Her porch light stayed on again. We still talked weekly, sometimes daily, but the urgency had faded. What remained was something steady, unspoken, and quietly important. We weren't dating. We weren't in love, at least not in the way people usually mean it. But every now and then, I'd find myself reaching for my phone when something funny happened. And 9 times out of 10, she was the one I wanted to tell. That weekend, the town held its annual community market. Craft booths, homemade jam, kids screaming near the face-painting tent. Not really my scene. But Linda asked if I wanted to go, just as friends, she said, grabbing her coat. "You don't have to pretend to like candles or earrings." She wore that denim jacket she always joked made her look like a country singer, and I wore the same boots I wore for work, mostly because I didn't own anything else that wasn't covered in drywall dust. We walked the aisles, sipping bad coffee from styrofoam cups, pointing out strange wood carvings and oddly shaped soaps. At one booth, she tried on a knitted hat that made her look 12 years old. She wrinkled her nose at her reflection and burst into laughter. So did I. I didn't hold her hand. Didn't even touch her shoulder. But we walked side by side like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's when Rachel showed up. She was trailing a kid. Probably her nephew, maybe someone else's. When she saw us, her eyebrows rose just slightly. Then she crossed her arms and gave a crooked smile. "She's smiling again," she said, almost to herself. "I don't care what label it has." Linda rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. I just nodded and smiled back. Later that evening, I found myself in Tom's garage again, sitting on the old fold-out chair we kept forgetting to fix. He handed me a soda this time. He was trying to quit beer. "She doing okay?" he asked. "She's doing," I replied. "Better than before?" He nodded. "You didn't get the girl, huh?" I laughed. "What girl?" Tom gave a half shrug, tapping his boot on the concrete. "Didn't get the girl. But maybe you both got something better." I looked at him. "You got peace." And he was right. It wasn't love. Not in the way that burns fast and loud and reckless. It was the quiet kind. The type that showed up with soup when you were sick or stuck around even when the garage light didn't need fixing. It was knowing someone would notice if you didn't text for a day. That someone would miss you, not because you were exciting, but because you were there. One evening I sat on Linda's porch. She brought out 2 mugs of tea and handed me one without a word. The sky was fading, orange melting into gray. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a wind chime danced faintly. We didn't talk much, just watched the light disappear together, and in that silence I realized something. I didn't want more than this. Not a proposal, not a label. Just this porch, these mugs, this person. Later, lying in my own bed, I thought about how it all began, with a flickering bulb and a messy garage and a joke I'll never forget. "I'm 50. Will you marry me?" "Just kidding," she said it with a laugh. But I remember now how something in her eyes didn't quite match the smile, and for the first time in years I hadn't felt like laughing. I'd felt seen. Maybe life doesn't always give you fairy tales. Maybe it just gives you chairs to fix, lights to change, and someone who keeps the porch light on for you just in case. And maybe that's more than enough.